this is my life's work. I don't know if I could like summarize it so neatly, but what I can say is that there are a lot of people who want to do away with the idea of a gender binary, who want infinite options. And I think some of it stems from our kind of indulgent culture that believes erroneously that more choice is always better. It sounds like a nightmare to me to wake up every day not knowing if there are four walls around you. And that's what deconstructing gender is. It sounds like a total nightmare because in order to function and in order to identify the things in life where choice really does matter, we need to be able to take certain things for granted. We need the floor underneath us to be solid.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Stephanie Winn, who's an LMFT, host of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast and creator of the ROGD repair course. A personal hero of mine. I'm so glad to have you with me, so thank you for joining me.
So great to be here, Ryan, and congratulations with everything that you're doing with the podcast. You've had so much going on the last several months, so many great guests.
Well, I got my start coming on your podcast, actually. That's what got me started.
I was happy to have you. I think you represent a pretty big part of the demographic of my podcast, like disillusioned therapists in training.
Yeah. So to start off, tell me who you are, your background, where you come from.
Yeah, sure. So I started my therapy career in California, did grad school there in the early 20s, followed a normal course for the early career development of a therapist, working in community mental health in California, and then in Oregon, transferring my licensure process as I moved states. Finally completing my license in 2016 with all the internship hours, the exam, and so on. I went into group practice in 2016 and then private practice in 2020. And I think a lot of what I've ended up becoming semi-famous for is what was downstream of, 2020, going into private practice at the same time as the pandemic exposed a lot of the cracks in our society.
I want to go back to grad school because something that I've noticed from interviewing a number of people is people who went to grad school more than 10 years ago, it seemed like they got really good training to be a therapist. And more recent people going to grad school, it was completely different. There's like almost no skills learned and complete indoctrination. What was your grad school experience like?
It was really a blend of the two. Like I had some excellent teachers. Shout out to David Akulian. He's still my favorite teacher from my memory of what grad school was for me between 2010 and 2013. I also had, I can't remember the guy's name, but a very old school psychodynamic teacher, and several excellent teachers. But I also had some misfortune right from the outset, actually. I could tell this story perhaps to illustrate what I'm talking about. So we're all familiar with the woke struggle session. My grad school experience started off with one. I can look back now and recognize that that's what it was. That's not what it felt like at the time. What it felt like was my nervous system being super activated by a very familiar feeling of being scapegoated, backed into a corner.
Did you think you were doing something wrong?
Absolutely.
Like it was your fault?
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's a familiar feeling for me. It goes back to childhood.
Yeah.
So my grad school experience started with a retreat, and during that retreat, we had several intensive classes, and one of them was this thing called a T group. Have you ever heard of a T group? It's sort of like an encounter group. It's basically you're with, I think, 12 to 15 people is how we divided up the groups, and a facilitator, and the only rules are you have to stay for the entire duration. Like you can only leave during scheduled breaks to go to the bathroom or whatever. And it was cumulatively many hours over several days. And you can only talk about what's happening here and now with the people in the room. So you can't, do the things that we would normally do as humans to socialize in a new group of people, like, oh, where are you from? Talk about sports, the weather, music, movies. You can't do that. You have to talk about how you're feeling with the people in the room right now. So kind of forces you into this potentially very intimate, potentially very confrontational experience. And after the fact, I was envious of people who were in other groups because I heard some of them had wonderful experiences and felt really close to the people they were in these groups with, but that was not my experience. Something happened early on within like the first hour or so of this group where a young woman was sharing her experience of feeling some type of way about being a minority. She was, I believe, Mexican, and she said something about feeling like judged or ostracized. I don't know what it was. It was some kind of negative emotion about her perception of what it was like to be a minority. And my response, I was trying to express sympathy. All I remember is it was some variation of, I'm sorry to hear you feel that way. Like, I really don't remember what I said that was so offensive. I mean, but now, I mean, you know the woke stuff, right? Like, I said something to try to express sympathy that she felt this way. And the way I said it, coming from this white person, was like, now all eyes are on me, and I am supposedly like disregarding her experience. I'm like minimizing her experience of microaggressions or something. And it just spiraled from there. And it turned into this like multi-hour like scapegoating session. And I was super activated because this was very reminiscent of my childhood trauma. And I was trying to turn to instructors for help. I was having a hard time learning how to advocate for myself because think about it, I'm 25 years old. I'm just starting grad school. There's a lot of power that this experience has to me. I want my teachers to like me. I want my peers to like me. We're supposed to get off to a good start here. I wanna feel confident, and so I'm turning to my teachers for help, and I don't really know exactly what my rights are. And that experience was used against me over the next several years. I had certain professors that decided in that moment that I was emotionally immature and just continued to treat me that way and even held me back later in my education when they hadn't even seen me for like a year. This one teacher who didn't like the way I reacted in that situation later made a decision as part of a team behind closed doors to not approve me to go on to the next phase of my internship. And I hadn't even talked to him in a year. And it was all, from what I could tell, I mean, the whole process was kind of obscure to me, but it was all because of how I reacted with intense anxiety when I'm brand new in grad school. I'm trapped in a room with these 12 people, and they're all looking at me, calling me racist. Ryan, that was also part of grad school in 2010. Yeah.
Yeah, that's just it's very familiar to me, but even it being familiar, it still seems wild. Something that I'm assuming you're kind of hinting at is like there's a certain ambiguity around it. Like the rules aren't printed anywhere. And I
Exactly.
would work so hard to make sure that everything I said, I was like, okay, this definitely isn't racist. It's not sexist. It's not transphobic. And then I would say something and somebody would go, well, what if the client's non-binary? Dang it. There's always something you forgot about, and it's hard to cover all your bases because there's these unknown rules. And then as soon as you slip up, oh, Stephanie's problematic for the rest of her time here. It's so hard to navigate this.
And I felt like it was honestly the luck of the draw that I ended up in that group in that time. And there was at least one person in that group who was sympathetic to me. I remember he was this older, kind of quiet, mild-mannered Asian guy. And I remember him like trying to help, but just not really able to kind of overpower the group dynamics. To be fair, like that mentality was a lot less prevalent than like it wasn't the majority. So for example, there was someone who was in several of my classes who was like the wokest person there. She was the one to introduce the term cis and ask that we all use it. I remember all of us just kind of being like, huh? And then I do have a fun story about her. I've told this one before. Tell me if you've heard it before. But we had a class about the client therapist relationship, and she was in that class. And at one point, our teacher asked us to divide into basically LGB and straight. Not to play some identity politics BS, but for legitimate reasons, to have people of gay experience talk about things that were unique to their experience and then come back and inform us later. It really was not woke the way the teacher went about it. But this wokest member of the group tried to join the LGB club even though she was straight. She said she identified as queer but she had a boyfriend or something, and the teacher was not having it. She was like, "No, go join the rest of the straights." So that was what that was like back in 2011, 2012, something like that. And I feel like today, 3/4 of the room would be on the, alphabet soup side, right?
Man, gosh, that brings up a good question. You talk about like it wasn't the majority of people that are like that one woman. If you had to guess, what percentage were like these diehard true believers, like I would kill and die for the cause, versus people who are just kind of going along with it just because that's what we do here.
Oh, I mean, back then it was when you describe the like ideological fervor of use language like diehard true believer, there wasn't a lot of that. There wasn't a lot of that in grad school. There was this one person, and yeah, I would say the rest of the people I went to grad school with, we were all like pretty progressive, but we were there to talk about psychology.
Mm.
It wasn't it didn't have the vibe of. Yeah, and I mean, even like the T group experience, it was only in retrospect that I can say, oh, that was coming from some woke beliefs. Like it felt like it was hit some emotional trigger for this peer of mine, this Mexican American woman who had expressed her pain. Like I had triggered her pain. That's what we were, well, it wasn't my fault though, but like I don't know.
You said everybody was pretty progressive, and that's like just the general attitude of my program, and from what I kind of see in the industry, it's like it's assumed that you're progressive. And something I've noticed is if like in my program, if somebody wants to comment like something was off in that class, they have to qualify themselves first. They're like, listen, I'm very progressive. Like I only vote Democrat. Like I've been a Democrat for a very long time. But did you see, like, you have to say that before you question it? Like, you have to add that, to
Yeah.
say, like, I'm a legitimate voice, basically.
Yeah, I'm really tired of that. And it's still, even people who are trying to exit that kind of cult mentality, like one thing I hear a lot in gender critical land is it's not transphobic to blah, 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 to want women to have their own spaces. It's not transphobic to care about the safety of children. It's not transphobic to blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, people, they made up the word transphobic to manipulate you. They're going to put that label on whatever they want. You need to stop defending yourself against this imaginary straw man they made up. Whatever they want to say is transphobic according to them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So you saw a little bit of this in grad school. When did you start to say to yourself, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore? Like something is seriously off here.
With regard to the woke stuff,
Yeah.
it was years later. I mean, that early experience really did just activate my childhood bullying shame and make me feel bad about myself. That's what that did to me. It didn't really make me question the whole thing. There were moments like, for example, in my first job in community mental health, there was a moment where an actively hallucinating young man with a shaved head who probably weighed close to 300 pounds claimed to identify as a woman and was placed in a female room. And then the actual woman that he shared that room with, who was a sexual assault survivor, ran away. Of course she did. Who could blame her, right? So there were things like that, right? Where I was not the decision maker. I was watching the office politics play out and the decisions being made. And, in this case, I remember the director of the facility saying we have to respect this person's gender identity, but I couldn't tell if she had any emotion behind that. And then I remember the counselor who was responsible for the young woman, because every resident had a counselor that was their person who was accountable for them. And this counselor was advocating for her. Like, she doesn't feel safe with men. This is a very large, imposing, obviously male person, right? So I remember stuff like that playing out and me just kind of sitting back and watching and going, wow, this is all kind of crazy. It wasn't until 2020 really that I saw a lot of the stuff unraveling. Because I mean, all through 2016, 17, 18, 19, I'm seeing more and more trans identified patients. I'm seeing all the things that aren't being addressed. I'm seeing how they're hiding behind gender identity, but at the same time, I'm going along with this, like, this is what I have to do to be a good person. Some of the things I feel most embarrassed about are like, I used the stupid genderbread person handout at one point. I taught trans identified people how to use the Refuge app, which, if you don't know, is or was an app for finding gender neutral bathrooms. I mean, I went along with it and, under this idea that it's all part of the same sort of humanistic, liberal, like, loving, open-minded approach, right? But meanwhile, I'm seeing all the, like, seeing a beautiful young woman who'd been through so much trauma, then suddenly deciding that she's trans, or, just all the young people where it's like they're kind of autistic, they're gay and they don't even know it, and I'm just like, wow, you decided to take testosterone and get your breasts cut off before you even figured these things out about yourself. Like, of course there's like little alarms going off in the back of my mind, but there's also this cognitive dissonance, and that part is still sort of the unconscious part of the iceberg, if you will. In 2020, that's like ideological extremism of the culture just became so intense. And I was seeing woke therapists in Facebook groups just driving each other absolutely bonkers. My story here is the wet hair story. So,
Yes.
as one tiny example of what was going on in this group before I eventually either got kicked out of it or left, I can't remember which, but every therapist I've talked to on the outside of this cult mentality remembers what was going on in that Facebook group. Therapists in Private Practice, the biggest Facebook group for therapists in the United States, at least it was like 5 years ago. But the group was run by a few woke bullies, and they would turn everything into a Facebook comment struggle session. And if you wrote something innocuous enough and then you got dogpiled and then you deleted it because you're like tail between your legs trying to run away from conflict like anyone would, then that was called dirty deleting. And that was another thing that you would get shamed for. You're not allowed to delete. You must leave receipts of your sins. So there was just a lot of BS and drama in that group. And one example was like, one day I posted a question I thought was pretty lighthearted and innocuous, which was something like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how unprofessional is it to come to session with wet hair? Because, as you know, Ryan, I struggle with time management, and there are days that I do not leave enough time for my hair to dry. And it may not be sopping wet, but it may not be completely dry either. So, I mean, I posted this as a lighthearted question, right? Like, really, how bad is it? Do I look completely irresponsible here, or is it, people even going to notice? Anyway, this turned into a struggle session because my question showed such a lack of understanding of people with different hair types, which is affected by their ethnicity. So, how dare I post a question like that when for people with kinky hair, it takes 12 hours for their hair to dry and they only wash it once a week, and I was supposed to know that. And my question was disrespectful to them somehow. So that's an example of like the mind virus just completely taking over and infecting every cell of the body, so to speak. It was things like that. But then the tipping point for me was when I was talking to one friend. It was 2020. I was talking to one friend about the fact that another friend was attending one of these protests. And I think the cognitive
Was
dissonance.
this like a gender protest?
No, it was
BLM?
the BLM protests of 2020. I think the cognitive dissonance for me at that point was pretty huge because I've been going along with the COVID narrative that there's this really dangerous virus and we can't step within 6 feet of each other, and we have to, just live this really restricted lifestyle. And that had been going on since the winter, basically. And now it was summer, and suddenly the narrative flipped, just like in 1984. The narrative flips and then they're erasing the previous day's news, where now it's perfectly okay for thousands of people to be in close proximity outside in the streets protesting because of George Floyd. Like, now that's the thing. I think my mind was like really struggling to reconcile how I've been avoiding human contact so intensely for several months. And now there's all these people like in close proximity. And I was trying to make sense of it. And I said something about the right side of history. I used that phrase in a conversation with a friend. And he said, "How do you know what's the right side of history?" And that was all I needed. That was the domino that sparked the chain reaction, because I was like, I don't. You're right, I don't. How do I know? That was it.
That's
And yep.
that is so wild. I mean, everything I've heard about these therapist Facebook groups just sound like a hornet's nest. Like, woke people are the most humorless people. You could say the most innocuous thing. Hey, isn't it nice that the sun's out today? So you're saying climate change is not an existential risk? Wow, dude. Like, there's no way to laugh around these people. It's you're just like high strung at all times.
Yeah, they're insufferable.
Man, the 2020 pandemic BLM stuff really got me too, because you started seeing like if things were politically correct or politically the right message, then reality didn't seem to matter. Like, the pandemic can't get you if you're fighting racism, or men can be women if they believe hard enough. You start
Hmm.
seeing all these things and you're like, look, I so badly want to be on the right side of history. I really want to be on your team, but like this just sounds ridiculous. And I think a lot of us had that breaking point at that time.
Hmm.
Man. So what did you do about that? You had this right side of history moment. Where did you go from there?
So that friend shared an episode of Dark Horse podcast with me. It was Brett Weinstein's roundtable with 9 Black intellectuals on race issues. And it was so refreshing because, I mean, part of the like tenor of the whole woke thing was like all this fear and rigidity and backwards movement around race. Like if you're white, you should be constantly walking on eggshells and afraid of offending anyone non-white and afraid of offending your fellow whites who will stand up for the non-whites and, tell you what you did wrong. I mean, the eggshell walking was immense, right? And then to see this white guy, Brett Weinstein, who's just like, let me talk to, just fearlessly inviting 9 Black people who are free thinking intellectuals and being like, let's talk about this without any fear. And seeing all of those people having intelligent conversations that were just a completely different tone than the way my woke colleagues were talking about these issues. I was like, oh, there's a way out of this. There are good, smart people who don't think like that, right? And then, so I learned about what happened at Evergreen. I started listening to Dark Horse. I got into a whole different algorithm. I was listening to a lot of like Coleman Hughes and John McWhorter around race. And then, you know, then I read Abigail Schreier and Deborah So. And so, like, all the race stuff and all the gender stuff, like, it all came tumbling down at once. And it was about a year and a half of intensely listening to podcasts and audiobooks while doing a lot of gardening that kept me sane during the pandemic.
It's really wild, and it's hard to even like figure out how to express this, but there's such a jarring difference between people like McWhorter and Coleman Hughes and Deborah So, who like they start out, their fundamental premise starting out is like, what is true? What does the evidence say? How can we figure out a better way to understand this? As opposed to, we better be very careful we don't say anything problematic. It's like, truth always takes a back seat in social justice to like, don't say anything problematic. Don't say anything that might go against the ideology or might offend people. And like, kind of when you break yourself of that, it's a whole freeing new world.
Totally.
So how were you received by fellow therapists when you started changing these views?
Well, I mean, mind you, like, so much of this is online. I didn't have a great local community in person. So I pretty quickly gave up on Facebook. I mean, Facebook was becoming outdated anyway. It's useful for marketplace and for theoretically it should be useful for like special interest groups. But I mean, with therapists, right? There's like therapists in private practice. I mean, I will say, there are Facebook groups that are active right now for non-woke therapists, and I'm glad they exist. I'm just not really active on Facebook anymore. But I mean, I think it was like a year and a half before I got on X and Substack and then started podcasting. And, so during that in between place, I think I felt pretty isolated and felt like most of my peers were people I hadn't met, who had podcasts and wrote books. Like that's where I was getting my ideas. And that's eventually why I did become public presence because I wanted to engage back. So how was I received by fellow therapists? I mean, at some point I crossed too many lines in the woke Facebook groups and got kicked out of them. And then, of course, pretty early into my foray into the public eye, because it was like September 2021 is when I joined then Twitter, now X. And I started Substack around that same time. That blog has now migrated to my website, which I kind of regret. Someone told me it'd be good for SEO, but Substack is a much better platform in my opinion. Anyway, I was tweeting, I was blogging, and I was beginning to record episodes of the podcast I would eventually launch in May 2022 when some trans rights activists found me and they're like, oh, this is a mental health professional, a licensed mental health professional who's accountable to a board, who believes the wrong ideas. Let's get her, because people like this should not be allowed to exist. It's funny, there's a lot of projection. Trans people, you're telling us that we should not exist. It's like, well, you're telling people like me that we should not exist, right? And I mean, that's what they use to create a false consensus, right? They'll say all these boards and all these people agree, blah, blah, blah. Well, part of the reason they're able to make it look that way is because they punish the people who disagree, because you're not allowed to have different opinions on these things as a professional, especially. So, I mean, before I could even launch my podcast, I was, notified that my licensing board had received complaints about me. I actually did get ahead of the issue because there were so many trans rights activists online telling me that they were reporting me to my licensing board in December of 2021 that I wrote to my licensing board that same month. And I was like, look, you're going to be receiving some complaints about me from these online activists. Here's what they're saying. Here's what I've actually said and not said. Here's what I believe about this issue. Here's why I believe it's appropriate to express these things as a professional. I got ahead of the issue. And if I do say so myself, I think my way of communicating with the board did ultimately help me, because when they did notify me about the complaints in April of 2022, that's when I got the notice right before I launched my podcast. It just, timing worked out that way. Crazy time in my life. I was also had just moved, was coming down with chronic illness. The house I'd moved out of was getting robbed. Like, all these things were happening in one very short span of time, but I was determined to launch my podcast anyway. So, of course, episode 11 of my podcast is me telling Helen Joyce the story of what happened with the licensing board complaints. Sorry, where was I going? It was all happening at once.
Yeah, I guess, how you were received in your field. I want to just thank you for being such a pioneer in what you're doing, speaking out, because I had people like you to look to as an example for me personally. And when somebody reported me to the dean for hate speech, and then I had to go meet with the director, you were one of the first people that I reached out to. And I thank you for your guidance on that. And, for me to look at you in your perspective, I don't know that, did you have someone to look to say, okay, this is my example of how to go about this?
Not really. I mean, I do have an incredibly supportive fiance. We're finally getting married. Soon enough, I'll be able to call him my husband. The wedding's very soon, but I mean, he's been in it for a while with me, and he's just always been there for me. And the thing is, he's been following my lead. I'm the one who's really intellectually driven. He's more of a dreamer. He's whimsical, he's creative, and he's definitely interested in culture. But I have been on this journey. The support that he's provided me just by loving me is what's allowed me to intellectually flourish and pursue my interests and find my courage. But that's all me. And I remember when my Facebook friends were attacking me. There's this one woke Facebook friend I was clashing with in 2020, and he said something like, must be that boyfriend of yours, or something like that. And I was like, and you call yourself a feminist? You're assuming that my intellectual ideas must be coming from a man. It's just, the hypocrisy is wild to me. But I mean, what I can say, I had a really supportive partner who just follows my lead, trusts my instincts, will support my exploration, wouldn't make the same choices himself, wouldn't want to put his head on the chopping block. But, so there's that. And then I didn't even know, it was already recording episodes of my podcast when one of my guests told me about Gender A Wider Lens podcast. I didn't know that there were therapists talking publicly about this issue. I thought I was the only one. So, I mean, I think GenSpect was just forming at that time. Therapy First, was then called Gender Exploratory Therapy Association. They were just forming at that time. I think the communication was a little haphazard. I wouldn't say that those people were like available to me as supports. I think they have a better structure now for maybe supporting new people, but I wouldn't say that structure was like there for me when it was happening to me. There were like random people, and one of them has asked not to be named, but like I will say someone who is very well respected in the field of like concerned professionals reached out to me, had some helpful chats. Like it was like here and there. It was kind of random. Mostly it was people thanking me from kind of the other side of themselves being anonymous and sort of like you saying, "Oh, thank you for leading the way." I'm like, "I'm leading? Me? I'm in charge now?" Okay, because I mean it really affected my nervous system. I mean, like I said, this was 3 years ago now, spring 2022. I moved, got burglarized, came down with long COVID, launched a podcast, and was under investigation by my licensing board all at the same time. I'm still recovering.
Yeah, I imagine. Man. So I was hoping we could get more into the like you've got this you
Sorry,
create
Ryan. I'm sorry. You cut out for a moment. The last thing I heard was I imagine.
Oh, sorry. So you created this ROGD repair course, and I'm wondering if you could tell me like because you were at least somewhat on board with it, which I mean you're talking about handing out genderbread material, which I understand because if you're a therapist, you can't possibly like pour over all the literature and be an expert on everything, and so you have to say what are best practices, and best practices for all the major medical and psychological organizations were saying like child gender transition is good. How is your thought shaped around this issue?
Gosh, I mean, I think there's like a. I'm sure you're going to have to edit this because it's going to take me a while to find my words.
You're good.
I've lost a lot of respect for credentialism. Like I think as a therapist, you spend all this time in grad school and then jumping through these hoops after grad school. There's this like real kind of like sense of like official credentialing bodies and what you have to do to become a respected member of the community and there's so much pseudoscience and there's so much BS. So, I think all of this was in response to a question you'd asked about, like, something about my feelings toward the
How
profession
did
of
your
care.
thinking on this issue evolve, I guess?
How did
'Cause
my
you
thinking?
went from handing out genderbread material
Yeah.
to like leading this ROGD repair course.
I mean, honestly, there were some very particular patients. Of course, I'm not going to describe anything about those individuals, but there were some very particular individuals I worked with where, because I'd seen people in the ideation stage of like thinking they might be trans, but not acting on it, like very early on. And then I'd seen people like post transition, whatever that means, like women on testosterone for several years before they'd come to me, breasts already removed, and so on. But it was part of what piqued me during that whole 2020 thing of everything falling apart was also working with patients as they were progressing through the identity and moving toward medicalization. That really opened my eyes because I think I didn't realize how serious it was until I'm, talking to my patient and they're like scheduling surgeries and I'm like, gosh, this is very, very real. So that was part of it. And then I think honestly just common sense. There's a lot more resources today than there were 5 years ago. I'm not downplaying the work that people were doing to create the resources that were available 4 and 5 years ago. I wasn't even aware what all those resources were. But a lot of it was honestly just giving myself permission to be a free-thinking individual with common sense, to be somebody who cares about health and knows a thing or two about hormones. I'm a woman who's very sensitive to my own hormonal fluctuations. I'm one of these women who's had a terrible reaction whenever I've tried something like hormonal birth control, for example. And so it's just putting two and two together. It's like if my, one or two little stints with putting the drugs in my own body uh that are my own sex hormones, just more of them, if my experiences of those could cause me constant tearfulness and panic like how powerful are cross-sex hormones. It was just giving myself the freedom to think about this and then to learn about the medical stuff and to hear the stories of detransitioners and detransitioner stories put everything in perspective with regard to the kind of creeping concerns I'd had in the back of my mind with patients, whether in the ideation stage or in the post-transition stage, because I could kind of put everything into place.
So tell me about the ROGD repair course. What goes into
Yeah.
that? Because like we talked about earlier, basically, I mean, American Counseling Association, American Psychological Association, they all say basically if a child is kind of gender confused, like you push them along that path, and you're saying something very different than all the major experts.
Well, so I've been doing this for a few years, having a public presence, a blog, a podcast. I was featured in a film. I then represented that film to the media. So, I've been out there. And that film, by the way, is No Way Back, The Reality of Gender Affirming Care. Great film, nowaybackfilm.com. So I've been out there. People have sought me out. Right. And so parents of trans identified youth started seeking me out. At first, I was turning them away, thinking they were looking for therapy. And, oh, okay, I'm not licensed to provide therapy in their state. And then I was just like, wait a minute. These people are reaching out to me because they've heard something I have to say and they feel like I have insight into this issue that would be valuable to them. So let me set aside therapy, say, okay, I'm not diagnosing, I'm not treating, you're not my patient, but you want to talk to me, tell me what's going on, tell me how I can help, why you're seeking out talking to me. So it turned out when I started listening to the people who were asking for my time, that there was a lot we had to talk about. And so I opened up a coaching and consulting side of my practice. So I was juggling all of these different things, right? Podcasting, therapy, coaching, and consulting. About a year ago, a little more than a year ago now, I reached a low point with my health and really had to decide what was most important to put my energy into. I decided to wrap up and put on hold my therapy practice, refer out all my patients, stop taking new patients, and really just focus on the parent coaching. And I did that, and it was a leap of faith. Actually, a mutual friend of ours, Karen King, helped provide me with some valuable guidance to take that leap of faith when I was talking things through with her. And then I was just focusing on how do I help these parents, and that was all I was doing. And having cleared the space of wrapping up my therapy practice, as my energy levels started to recover from that really low point I was at a little over a year ago, I found myself having the energy, motivation, and clarity to take everything that I was learning from working with these families and put it into a course. I did some kind of practice stuff to get there. Like I had this Marco Polo Sharecast. So I had this like private video message stream that I would send people just whenever I had an idea. I'd pick up the phone, record a message, say, and it would be like after talking to one family where we talked about a very particular issue. And that same insight I knew would apply to other families. I would say, okay, let me just kind of leave everyone who's in this thing a message so they can use this. So I had all this kind of practice, like identifying what are the important themes for these families to understand when it comes to the psychology of gender confused youth and the communication issues in the family. All of that turned into a course. I was building that course this time last year. I launched it in August 2024. And it's been a hit. People find it really helpful. I'm really, really glad to have found this. I don't know if you're familiar with that Japanese concept of ikigai, the intersection of what you love to do, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can get paid to do. But I feel like this course and this parent coaching work is really that sweet spot for me.
That's incredible. That's so awesome. What can you tell me about rapid onset gender dysphoria? Because from what I can tell, you know this issue a lot better than I do. It seemed like there was this extremely rare phenomenon of like middle-aged men with kind of like a sexual fetish around transition. And then all of a sudden there's this explosion of like teens and earlier. How did this, it was social media? Like, how did this happen?
Well, that's kind of a long story. So the term rapid onset gender dysphoria, I believe, was coined in 2018 by Lisa Littman and published in her study on this phenomenon. She was a physician and a researcher who was noticing this exponential growth in the number of youth identifying as trans and did a study on it, much to the dismay of trans rights activists who want you to believe that there is no exponential growth. And if there is, it's only because of greater acceptance, blah, 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 blah. But this trend of young people without any history of childhood so-called gender dysphoria suddenly identifying as trans during adolescence or young adulthood. And that phenomenon, I mean, has been widely witnessed, and there is a lot of data to support its existence, much of which is just right in front of our eyes. Now, some people who believe in the idea of true trans, for instance, care greatly about differentiating between ROGD and classic, as it's called, gender dysphoria, which I don't care all that much because I don't believe I don't believe in trans. I think it's a myth. I believe there are people who think they're trans and that word has meaning to them. I believe there are people who alter their bodies, but I've also met people, not that many, but I've met people who had kids that fell into the classic childhood gender dysphoria and grew out of it. So what we do know, let me put it this way, what we know historically from before this became the cultural phenomenon that it is today is that those children who engage in a lot of, sort of cross-sex behavior in terms of the way they play and dress and who they hang out with and their mannerisms and who might even say, I am the opposite sex. It was typically boys identifying as girls, and these were typically growing up to be gay men, right? We all know that. And then, some with the girls becoming lesbians, we all know that. Now it's changed a lot because the cultural and the times have changed. But still, what we know about, again, historically, those children is that they just needed the freedom to grow up and discover themselves, and that gender dysphoria would tend to dissipate with adolescence. However, I mean, with going through puberty, right? And with discovering their sexual attraction. However, a lot of people misinterpret that to say that anyone with gender dysphoria will grow out of it if you give them enough time. And that's not true in this cultural environment, right? There can be kids with a history of behavior during childhood that was very typical for their sex. That's what a lot of these kids are now, right? They were girly girls and boyish boys who develop this trans identity in adolescence or early adulthood. They will not grow out of it if you just give them time. The cultural context has changed. So that's why we need tools like the ROGD repair course for parents. I work with a lot of parents in these very high stakes situations. The clock is ticking. Their kid's about to turn 18. I work with lots of parents of over 18s as well. But, it's like, okay, in 6 months, your kid is going to be free to walk into Planned Parenthood and get a prescription for cross-sex hormones. So I can't remember what the question was. Sorry, Ryan.
I mean, we're going in so many different interesting directions. I don't know if it matters anymore. I feel like it's one thing to talk about kind of a binary trans issue because we have like a reference point. We have a frame of reference. So like I as a man look at you as a woman and say, oh, I want to be that. That's what I feel like. Make me that, right? But we get into non-binary. We lose our reference points. So I could identify, I've heard and seen people identify as aliens, cartoon characters. One person identified as their anxiety. Like that's my gender is my anxiety. Like when you start to get into these type of non-binary identities, you kind of lose that frame of reference. How do you deal with someone at that point?
How do you deal with someone at that point? I guess it depends on who you are and who they are to you.
Like if you're coaching them, for instance.
So if I was coaching the parents of a non-binary identified kid, yeah, I mean, this is my life's work. I don't know if I could like summarize it so neatly, but what I can say is that there are a lot of people who want to do away with the idea of a gender binary, who want infinite options. And I think some of it stems from our kind of indulgent culture that believes erroneously that more choice is always better. We know that's not true when it comes to happiness. That's why you feel happier shopping at Trader Joe's than Safeway, because Trader Joe's gives you 2 options for a particular type of product and Safeway gives you 20. So, I mean, the paradox of choice is real. It's a well-documented, well-understood phenomenon. It sounds like a nightmare to me to wake up every day not knowing if there are 4 walls around you. And that's what deconstructing gender is. The idea of being gender fluid, for instance. I had just this past week, one of the parents I work with sent me a PowerPoint presentation that their child had made introducing the idea of gender fluidity. It sounds like a total nightmare because in order to function And in order to identify the things in life where choice really does matter, we need to be able to take certain things for granted. We need the floor underneath us to be solid. Sex is fixed. It's fixed at conception. Everything in your life is downstream. To be able to make other decisions freely, you need to accept that which cannot change as a fixed point in your life so that you can identify the things in life that are truly fluid. So I think it's absolutely disastrous for mental health to deconstruct that, to make it this like choice that you figure out who you are each day or anything like that. And indeed, what we see is it creates more neuroticism. We see higher levels of depression and anxiety in those people. Why? Because depression and anxiety are pretty much indistinguishable from rumination. For poor mental health, to encourage people to think about the idea that something like gender could be fluid or could be anything other than what you were given when you were conceived.
Wow. So you have left therapy in favor of coaching. Leslie Elliott Boyce also abandoned like the therapy side to go to coaching. I've talked to a number of people who either were on that path or were licensed therapists who used to do that and now coach. I'm wondering, do you think that the therapy profession is worth saving?
It's a good question. I don't know. I feel like we're in limbo right now. I feel like some of us are kind of like stepping out of it to see what happens. I'll return to it when it feels safe to return to. It kind of feels like a house on fire right now. And like, I'm waiting to see, like, is anyone going to put out the fire? Like, I don't know. There are people doing amazing work, like the folks at Critical Therapy Antidote and Open Therapy Institute and, groups like this. The thing is, like, let's think about this economically. The world is shifting so rapidly with AI. Like, a lot of people in other professions as well don't know what they should be doing right now, if their jobs will exist in 5 years. Coaching is viable as a profession when there's something that you're really good at and known for. That's how I got into it. I had a public presence. People heard what I had to say on a particular issue. They felt like I was the right person to talk to about that issue, and they reached out to me. You can't just not have any public expertise and put yourself out there as a coach and expect to make a living that way. And so as a profession, there will be a handful of so-called coaches in any field who got into that because people heard what they had to say and felt like they were the right person to talk to about a given issue. That's not a viable path for the vast majority of people who would pursue a profession like therapy. They don't necessarily want to be a blogger or a podcaster or a big presence on social media. I honestly find fame stressful myself. As I was telling you over X over the last few days, of course I'm happy to talk to you, Ryan. All the favorite people I've met in my 150 plus episodes of podcasting have been people less famous than me. I do not enjoy the company of people more famous than me, with like one exception. And that's Heather Hying. She's great.
Yeah, I could see that. I can imagine.
Well, funny. I told you this all started with Dark Horse podcast. And my friend who told me about Dark Horse, I was like, I'm going to meet them one day. And he laughed at me. And then I had the pleasure several years later of hosting a dinner party with him and Heather Hying and be like, see, dude, I was right.
That's so
I
cool.
should. Anyway, I'm sure I'm sure she's not the only exception of someone who's technically more famous than me that I have met in the last few years who I still respect and admire. My point is, most therapists don't want to be you or me. They don't want a podcast. They just want to do therapy. They might want to live a quiet, private life. They might want to create steady income stream for their family without everything that comes with having this public presence. And so are they going to make a living doing coaching? I don't think so. Why would anybody pick them as a coach if they don't know who they are or what they're, you want a therapist who's gone through jumped through some hoops, proved themselves to some accrediting body, because you want to be able to count on a minimum standard of competence, same as you would with any other professional. And so what are we going to do about all the people who are good at this work and feeling really burned out? Like, I would say, like, some of my personal friends fall into this category. Like, I went for a walk this weekend with a friend who's this kind of person. Doesn't want a public life, just wants to feed her family and do meaningful work. She's a good therapist, but she's so burned out because of the nature of the field and how that affects the types of clients that are looking for therapy and what their expectations are in therapy. So, what about all the people like her who just want to do good, meaningful work and just want to help people identify the beliefs that are getting in their way of being happy and healthy and what happens when those beliefs are tied into people's identities? I don't know what we're going to do for all of those therapists who have these gifts to offer the world. And I don't know what we're going to do for all the disillusioned people who could really use therapists like that, but who've lost trust in our profession because of therapists like the ones who bullied me over the wet hair issue.
So coaching is not a viable option for most people. Most people who think I want to make a living out of helping people talk through their mental and emotional issues, like that's not a viable option. So therapy, especially since you can bill insurance is if you have some kind of license, that makes the most sense for most people. But as you and I have talked about quite a bit, there's a lot of issues in our field. How would you, this is like a ridiculously big question, how would you start to begin to fix the therapy profession?
How would I, you mean if I was like queen for a day,
If
right?
you have like a magic wand, you're queen,
Uh-huh.
empress of the universe.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's a big title. How would I begin to fix the profession? I don't know. There are so many people in the profession now who are really attached to dogmatic beliefs, but I think we're gonna have to change the standards, right? So, like, for example, you would think it should go without saying that, like, racism has no place in therapy, for example, right? But there's a lot of like anti-white racism that's very prevalent, and that I think there are therapists out there with clearly like anti-white biases who get away with that and who can post it on social media and can say things to their clients that are really inappropriate.
We have a solution for that, though. You just say that bias against white people is not racism. Then you solve that.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Right. Well, when I'm empress, those are reportable offenses, right? We're changing the standards. We're shifting the ethos so that, you can't be in the profession and publicly or professionally hold those types of beliefs. What we're going to do with the whole gender thing. Oh man, like there's a lot of debate over this in gender critical circles. Like a lot of people they want to see blood, they want to see heads roll. I understand, right? Like they want to see people in jail. They want to see people at least lose their licenses. I think that it's a really complicated question. Who should actually face some kind of professional discipline for their part in this? Because there's so many people who've just been going along with this, right? Like, how do you identify who's guilty? Would I be found liable for my role if we suddenly change the standards so that we collectively agree that what we did was wrong? And then if we look to punish people who went along with it, would I be punished for the fact that I went along with it for a time? What do you have to do to repent for your sins here? I don't know. I really don't know, because I mean, I want to find ways forward that value the things I value, like, forgiveness and redemption and renewal. And like you probably saw my ex post the other day where I was like, here's an idea. Let's declare June Humility Month and go out in the streets saying, we're so sorry. We made a really big mistake. We were wrong about gender affirmation. Please forgive us. Please join us. It's okay to admit you were wrong. Like, there needs to be, I just feel like that type of remorse is not a popular thing in our culture right now. Like, even news outlets that should be leading the way, demonstrating professionally what it looks like for a reputed institution to take accountability for their wrongs. Like, you see news outlets changing their story as they're going with whatever way the wind is blowing. But how often do you see them say, we ourselves were wrong? We published misinformation, or we were bullied into submission and afraid to stand up for what we thought was right. Right. So if like it's not popular in the media, And if we live in a time where we're also afraid of each other, that we're afraid that, any admission of guilt or weakness, remorse, humility will be weaponized against us, how do we create a culture that's going to allow people to do better on this issue? I don't know.
Say, I think people like you deserve a lot more grace. If you're just saying, okay, what are best practices? Here's this handout that I'm told is most useful, versus people like W Path who knew what they were doing, they knew the harm that they were causing, and they kept pushing it anyway. I feel like that those two categories have to be treated very differently.
Fair. W Path's not a person, though.
Well, Marcy Bowers is a person, and
There you go.
a lot of people working there are people who
Yeah.
were actively involved in suppressing evidence.
Yep. Fair.
Okay. Last question for you. When you think of society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
I'm going to answer that in sort of a sideways way because I don't think it's about what we're talking about. I think it's about what we're doing.
Mm.
We need to be having more fun, like good, clean, family friendly, wholesome fun. We need to be socializing and like creating culture. So, I'm having a wedding soon, and I was talking to a friend about my wedding, and like we were both admitting like neither of us have been to many weddings because people just aren't having weddings. She was saying her sister eloped, and I was like, yeah, don't you hate that? Like some of my friends have eloped or had weddings so small that I wasn't there, or just not gotten married, or I met them after they were married or divorced, or like a wedding. I've heard it described as a community service. It's part of creating culture. I'm creating this experience that I've been planning for a long time now by curating a multi-sensory experience for my 70 favorite people, And there's going to be my favorite music and my favorite food and my favorite activities and my favorite people. And I want to see more of that. It doesn't always have to take the form of a wedding. A wedding is a very time, money intensive, thing to create. But I do wish that there was more happening. Like, I feel like we're all spending so much freaking time online. There's just not a lot happening when it comes to cultural events and people being social and creating community and creating art and music and things like that. And the left has dominated those activities, at least in certain parts of the world, like the one I live in. Like, my friend and I were also talking in the same conversation about how we don't go to the places where these things are happening because, again, it's, as you were saying at the beginning of the conversation, it's assumed that if you're a good person, if you're one of us, you think like us, and you want to participate in these particular rituals of stating your pronouns and hating Trump and things like that, right? And so I think people who listen to podcasts like yours need to build community and create like real life things happening, not just online talking heads.
Completely agree with that. Touch grass and talk to people face to face. It's interacting with a screen name it doesn't give you the same like basic biology of interacting with a human, when you actually talk to and touch a real person. It's a completely different experience, and it touches your mind and soul in different ways.
Yeah. That, and the other thing we need is mentorship. So one activity I'm trying to create in my life right now is like one of my hobbies is making jewelry. And I have been trying to get together with my friend's daughter so I can teach her to make jewelry. And like everyone's so busy, it's been impossible to nail down a time. But we need to be spending time with young people. We need young people to have role models, not just influencers.
I love that. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for being my mentor in a lot of ways. I really appreciate that. And I enjoyed this conversation. I'd love to talk to you again anytime.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.